Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our third webinar event in the fight against systemic racism in our communities. My name is Nosheen Hussain, my pronouns are she and her, and I'm one of the organizers for the South Asian Allyship Network, or as we affectionately like to call ourselves, SAN. A little bit about our organization. SAN was first started by public health professionals with the endeavor to mobilize the South Asian diaspora to advocate for social justice and human rights. We use the term South Asians to refer to individuals and communities whose ancestors originated in the Indian subcontinent. However, we recognize that many people, including Indo-Caribbean and brown people from African countries, may not identify as such. We understand the inadequacies of this political identity, and through our dialogues, we strive to make it an inclusive space and capture the complexities of the South Asian diaspora histories driven by colonialism, imperialism, and migration. I'm really excited for our event today. And, we're all just co-learners in this space today. And we encourage you all to take notes, to be present, and to actively engage with the conversations taking place here and beyond this space. We invite you to submit your questions and comments on YouTube throughout the session so we can integrate them into our conversation. The main thing that we're hoping for is that our collective learning will extend beyond today and into transformative action. I want to start off our event today with a land acknowledgement to bring attention to the Indigenous erasure that has taken place over generations on Turtle Island and what we now call North America. Indigenous people were the first land and water protectors. When colonizers came, Indigenous people, through treaties, agreed to share the land. This talk is contextually taking place in the area known as Toronto, which is cared for by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations, and this territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Just a reminder that these treaties have not been upheld by our government. We also have a speaker joining us from the unceded ancestral and occupied traditional lands of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations of the Coast Salish peoples, or what is colonially known as Vancouver. Many of us are settlers here on Turtle Island. As settlers, we not only should be aware of our settler status, but be completely cognizant that the privileges we enjoy are at the expense of this land's Indigenous people and the forcibly displanted Black lives that helped build the land's infrastructure. As a daughter of a Bangladeshi refugee and immigrant, I've grown up feeling a sense of gratitude for all this country has given my family and I. However, there's a sense of nuance when it comes to acknowledging gratitude as either immigrants or as children of immigrants. Due to the long history of colonization in our ancestral lands, we've been conditioned to thank colonial entities for allowing us to exist, because that agency through colonization has been stripped from us. For many immigrants to the West, was a result of colonization creating unsafe climates or a dearth of economic opportunities in our mother country. While we can be grateful for our safety on this land, we must recognize we might not have come here had colonization not impacted the political and economic climate in our countries. We must recognize the history of Black liberation that afforded us with the opportunity to immigrate. Gratitude for the life and opportunity you have, and the recognition for the truly violent and genocidal history of Canada can and should coexist. Understanding that we are still finding successes in the very same colonial structures that systemically oppress Indigenous and Black communities. Today's conversation looks within. By looking within, we hope to recognize the myriad of ways our communities are primed to be tools in white supremacy in the settler colonial state. Understanding our complicity is the first step we take towards dismantling these systems. We're building on the very important conversation started by Shri Paradkar's article in the Toronto Star entitled, "Dear Brown People, I'm about to wash some dirty laundry in public." The webinar entitled "Brown Complicity and White Supremacy," hosted by York University's Department of Education, South Asian Dialogues on Policing and Racism in Canada, hosted by the South Asian Network for Secularism and Democracy, and all the work done by Equality Labs, including this morning's conversation on caste and colorism, all of which will be available on our resource sheet in the description section of this video, and we urge you to check out. We must recognize that even the term South Asian is a catch-all identity politically, which significantly erases power dynamics, particularly across religion, nationality, and caste. And casteism, a topic we hope to delve into further today, remains central to this conversation about anti-Blackness in our communities. The caste system, an occupational and religious division of people that determines a person's social position at birth, still exists in South Asian communities today. Tanmuri Sundarajan, adult activist and executive director of the Equality Labs, points out that casteism is how all our communities have first been socialized to think about hierarchies. These oppressive systems shape our communities to show up in our diaspora, and affect how we've been primed to be willing participants in the artificial hierarchy that places white people at the top and Black people at the bottom, with us somewhere in the middle. This quickly puts us in opposition to all other communities that are fighting white supremacy, making it easy to ignore the violence and injustice Black and Indigenous peoples face. But we forget whose activism has made it possible for us to be here at all. We owe our right to live, work, and exist here to Black activists and communities who pushed for equality and civil rights during the 60s and 70s and still continue to engage in activism that benefits us all. Collectively, we as South Asians have done very little to dismantle these systems of oppression and support the liberation of Black communities. As long as we are divided and working for our own interests, there will be no community coalition in displacement of white supremacy. However, we must remember investing in Black liberation and Indigenous self-governance requires us to simultaneously work on issues of oppression within our communities, negate the model minority myth, and to engage in coalition building. Using the Accomplices, Not Allies framework developed by the Indigenous Action Center, we understand that Black and Indigenous liberation will lead to a collective liberation for all oppressed peoples in the current system. So now that I've taken sufficient airtime, I want to introduce the actual people you've come here to listen to, our distinguished speakers. Our first speaker, Sri Paradkar, is a race and gender columnist at the Toronto Star, who's today been named Toronto Star's first internal ombud, a role that is best described as a safe place for Black, Indigenous, and people of color journalists and all journalists to express editorial-related discrimination and bias concern. Please extend a heartfelt congratulations to her. She's also authored the aforementioned article, Dear Brown People, I'm about to wash some dirty laundry in public. Consider this an overdue act of tough love, garnering widespread attention for openly calling out South Asian complicity and upholding white supremacy and perpetuating anti-Black racism. She was the 2018-2019 recipient of the Atkinson Fellowship in Public Health when she investigated the failures and breakthroughs in our education system. She was also recently awarded 2 Amnesty International Awards in human rights reporting. Now, to truly make this a national affair, I'd like to welcome Harsha Walia, a South Asian activist and writer, and a third guest we have here, joining us from Vancouver. She is the executive director of the British Columbia Civil Liberties Association, an independent organization mandated to promote, defend, sustain, and extend civil liberties and human rights in Canada. She has been involved in community-based grassroots migrant justice, feminist, anti-racist, Indigenous solidarity, anti-capitalist, Palestinian liberation, and anti-imperialist movements for over a decade. Harsha is formally trained in law, works with women in Vancouver's downtown east side, and is the author of Undoing Border Imperialism, a book that analyzes migrant and social justice organizing and movements in North America. I welcome you both to this conversation.
Hi.
I want to start off this evening's conversation by actually asking Sri. I've spoken now twice about this article that you've written calling us out, and I think, no matter how many times you mention it's not enough, because in your article, you've done so much, and you've also highlighted a very important fact, which is that 2 years ago, you called out various forms of discrimination within South Asian communities at a keynote you were giving, and you were a minority within a minority then. So what do you feel has changed since then within our communities? And, why was now the right time for this candid call out?
Mm-hmm. First of all, thanks so much for inviting me along with Harsha, whom I really look up to and also for everyone who's here who's taking time to be with us. In the interest of contextualizing myself, I'm going to just take a few seconds to list out some of my identities because they are all riddled with tension. I am not an activist, I'm not an academic, although I'm very influenced by both. But I am with a for-profit mainstream media, a very white-centered media organization. I am an immigrant, but I am cisgender, heterosexual, able-bodied, woman of color, and I'm Brahmin, unbearably Brahmin. And by that, I mean pre-independence history of family in the RSS level of Brahmin. And so there's a lot of, if there's a ledger of oppression and oppressed, then there's a lot of tension going on there. And I would say that there's much more white adjacency in my identities than there is of being oppressed. So it's really important for me to acknowledge all of that before I just get into that story that I wrote. That story had been in me for years, and it never seemed to be the right time. I didn't have the analysis in the beginning, and also Donald Trump was elected, and then everything was about whiteness, white supremacy, and I have to respond to the news, and it never seemed to be the right time. And so, just purely journalistically, when there is this reckoning of anti-Black racism, of course there has to be this reckoning of anti-Black racism among South Asians as well. But I'm going to say what has changed is that there was always Black activism, there was always Indigenous activism and resistance and a long history of it in Canada. If we have Black Lives Matter today, we had the BADC, Black Action Defense Committee, say in 1992, or if Natasha Henry, who's an academic and a historian, will tell you that you have documented histories of Black parents resisting the education system back in 1840s. So all of that resistance and activism continues today. We have Black voices, we have Black academic knowledge, we have Indigenous voices, Indigenous academic knowledge, plus we have access to information. And so what I believe has changed now is mainstream media's stranglehold over the function of gatekeeping. And that has sort of loosened a little bit. One example I would offer is day 19 of the Mohawk demonstration that was in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs in BC who were against the Coastal GasLink natural gas pipeline running through unceded territory. And I was watching what was going on in the Tyendinaga Nation, which is near Belleville, Ontario. And there was CBC broadcast and there was Real People Media's broadcast. And the CBC was at a distance. There was a big truck that, massive like artillery trucks or military trucks that had blocked off most of the view. And the reporters were saying things like, well, it doesn't seem that there's much going on right now. It all seems quiet. Whereas the Real People's Facebook live stream was showing a completely different story. It was showing a face-off where clearly the police were the aggressors. And to me, that was a point that showed how one-sided has been the narrative that we've been fed because of that gatekeeping function, and how, whether it's because of social media or the availability of digital platforms, that we now have more access to information that we didn't before. And that tension between thinking that we were all suffering equally under whiteness or white supremacy or whatever language that we had became untenable with the knowledge of what we are seeing as the continuing dehumanization of Black and First Nations, Métis and Inuit people. And I think there was this, I sensed from conversations I was having with people, from what I was seeing, that there was this thirst to have an open discussion because it hasn't been had. And it's always been in the context of whiteness erasing brown people. And so that's why I thought now was a good time to have this information. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Shri. And I think, this call out has made us all think so much about our positionality and, what it means, because kind of what we've thought about so far is kind of all being questioned, and we're trying to figure out like what it means to be a South Asian in North America. And so with this, I want to ask Harsha, and I'll give her some time to introduce herself as well. But I want to ask that now that there's a growing number of us who are struggling with confronting and demanding change to systemic discrimination in North America, while we also kind of struggle with this, denial or ignorance to racial injustices, sexism, casteism, and religious persecution in our ancestral land. So, the question becomes, like, can you truly be an accomplice to Black liberation and Indigenous self-determination without addressing both? And how do you go about that? And what do we center in this context?
Yeah, thank you for that question, and hi everyone. And as was mentioned, I'm on unceded Coast Salish territories, lands of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish people, and I extend my gratitude, my deep gratitude, and thanks for being here on their territory, and very much understand the ways in which I am on stolen land. And this land is not treaty land; it is unceded land. So not all of Canada is actually under treaty, and the lands that I'm on are what we know as unceded because no treaties were made. And in fact, treaty making is now part of what the provincial and federal government is trying to do to continue to assert and steal Indigenous lands. I think the question around how do we as South Asians understand ourselves or be responsible accomplices to Black and Indigenous liberations in the context of systemic oppression is an important one, because I think there's quite a few things there, right? One is the ways in which South Asian, as you mentioned earlier in the introduction, is such a problematic kind of term and homogenizes so much. But I think, amongst all of those kinds of homogenizations, there's a few that are stark always, but especially right now are so heightened, right? To lump in India, which is an imperial power, militarily occupying Kashmir, and just generally such an imperial power in the region and the world, in the same category as other kinds of, people of origin from other countries, is so deeply problematic. And people who come fleeing, fleeing Hindutva, for example, or fleeing various forms of persecution, to assume proximity with South Asian more so than other, say, refugees, is tenuous, right? And also, of course, caste is a huge indicator and a huge measure also of the problematic ways in which South Asian kind of lumps people together. And of course, caste emerging particularly within Hindutva and Hindu scripture, but really applying across the region. I think that's an important one, because when we think about the South Asian diaspora, particularly in the North Indian context, we're talking not only about the migrations from South Asia, we're talking about the migration of caste as well, and the ways in which caste reproduces itself. And so I think it's important to implicate and problematize and nuance these categories, as many people have done. And Equality Labs was mentioned, and they're phenomenal, doing phenomenal work about really highlighting how it's not contradictory or distraction. In fact, it's hypocritical to talk about liberation and alliance with Black and Indigenous people without implicating caste, right? It's not to say, oh, now you're just adding caste into the mix. In fact, it's necessary because it is, as you mentioned in the introduction, such a foundational structure through which South Asians understand and conceive of hierarchy and systems of power. And that, it translates, and it's not equivalent to race, but caste is such a determinant of how we understand the world through hierarchy, and this idea of who belongs where, right? The hierarchies of humanity are so dictated by caste. And so I think those are so important to include in our conversations. And again, the work, particularly of organizations like Equality Labs and others, to really forefront and to say that, it's not only hypocritical for South Asians to only talk about white supremacy and to flatten hierarchies, as Shri, you were mentioning, to assume that we're all impacted by white supremacy, and that, our biggest concern is, white women appropriating bindis and saris, like who cares? But really that it's, we also can't flatten the idea of who's South Asian, right? So in the same way that we can't flatten racialized people across, that BIPOC means that there is a very distinct difference between Black and Indigenous and POC identities. There's also a difference in the context of South Asian identities. And that informs then how we show up for Black and Indigenous struggles. So I think that's key. And for me, that really crystallized, I'll share a couple of quick stories in a few ways in my experience, primarily as an organizer. And I will say, because we were also talking about the ways in which immigrants particularly have benefited. And I'm specific here about immigrants because, people who are undocumented or non-status or refugee have distinct lived experiences than immigrants. There's a lot of overlap there, but for lack of a better word. But, in the 1960s, one of the things immigrants talk a lot about is the 1967 Immigration Act, right? Which is the Immigration Act that made it easier, that opened the doors to Canada for middle-class immigrants or, largely middle-class immigrants. But what we don't often talk about, and, Robin Maynard's amazing book, Policing Black Lives, really highlights, is the ways that at that same time in 1966 was the foundation and formation of Canada's migrant worker program. So at the same time as, we're sitting here celebrating Canada for opening up its doors to immigrants, problematic in so many ways, right, on Indigenous lands, that's also the exact same time that Canada is starting to formalize its indentureship of migrant workers, right, on farms, in domestic work. And so it's really important to see the very tangible ways in which, when we talk about the ways in which our lives are built on Black struggle, but really that this is also within our generation, right? How immigration was offloaded, the burden of immigration and the indentureship of immigration was really offloaded onto primarily Caribbean workers, while predominantly Asian and Southeast Asian and South Asian immigrants arrived to Canada. And so in the spirit of, thinking through immigration particularly, because that's where a lot of my organizing has been, there's, in 2010, prior to 2010, in 2008, there was a Punjabi Dalit refugee who was being deported from Canada, Lembar Singh. There was many reasons that the South Asian community, and specifically I'm speaking here to the Punjabi community and the Punjabi Sikh community, which I'm part of, didn't support Lembar Singh when he was being deported. One is that he was a Dalit refugee. So as you can imagine, again, all the ways in which, caste and ideas of who has a right to belong showed up. The fact that he was a refugee specifically. So again, in the context of the Sikh community, refugees who are, directly fleeing the Sikh genocide in the 1980s are who we typically understand as refugees. So we come from a refugee community, but not a Dalit refugee. And also he was paralyzed, and he became paralyzed in Canada as a result of a work injury and was no longer mobile. And so the fact that, the Punjabi community couldn't really fit him into the category of quote unquote productive, right? And the ways in which ableism showed up in this conversation. And so at that time, a number of us were organizing, and we were organizing under the idea that, no one should be deported. Absolutely no one should be deported, but without the kind of attention we needed to give to the ways in which our community was responding to caste and ableism, and, his access to all of these kinds of hierarchies. And so, that's one of the very clear ways. There's so many ways, but in which we could see the same kind of logic of disposability of who we care about, whose humanity we care about, showing up in our own communities, right? And then we see the ways in which that extends to so many other communities and ideas of who we show up for, who do we consider in the fight, who will we fight for? Things really turned, I should say, in the struggle for Lembar Singh, and it was also, as riddled and fraught as it was also monumental. It was one of the most significant direct actions in North American history, where the day of his actual deportation, 3,000 people showed up to the Vancouver International Airport, mostly elderly aunties and grandmas, to physically block his deportation. His deportation was physically blocked. Canada Border Services Agency could not deport him. And mostly immigrant aunties and grandmas, not the kind of gatekeepers of the communities and the politicians, showed up to defend and protect him. And mostly also aunties and grandmas and bibis who were, coming themselves from, lower caste oppressed backgrounds, not landowning families, and deeply working class families. And so I think they all kind of complicate the ways in which we show up, because I think a lot of times when we're talking about South Asian relations with Black and Indigenous people, we're often defaulting to a certain kind of South Asian presence that invisibilizes the fact that we are many, we're not homogenous. And so we have to also think about who we are when we're thinking about South Asian showing up, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think, you brought up these stories and kind of problematized the identity of South Asian and like how many different dimensions we miss in kind of this catch-all term. And so I kind of want to probe a little bit more into casteism in the Canadian context. And I think you started that, by sharing this story with us. And I maybe want to jump to Shri as well, because I know you kind of talked about this in your introduction too. So systemically, like what does casteism look like in the Canadian context? And Quality Labs has done a great job of kind of starting that conversation in the States. And are we seeing that same kind of mass, or are we seeing that kind of dialogue in Canada? And if we're not, why is that?
So it's really important for me to not weigh in as any kind of expert on casteism, because there are really strong voices. Harsha, the link that you shared that was a talk on Tuesday between Equality Labs, and then there was Poetic Justice, I think, from Vancouver. And I managed to get a little bit of that, just listen in a little bit. And the fact that there is such a place in Canada like Poetic Justice means that that's the leadership that we'll have to follow. But I do want to say that the way Brahminism works is that caste is so, we have the privilege of not even understanding the basics of the system that we're privileged from. We don't have, until I saw a couple of years ago, Equality Labs' diagram that showed how caste is broken down, I didn't even know, because the realization that has come to me, and I want to do this without centering it on me, is, that my understanding of Hindu culture is entirely Brahmin. It is entirely Brahmin. And so I am not in a position to, I am in a position to question myself and to question people like me and to do that. But the effects of casteism is something that I can amplify if I am ever given that, if I'm ever trusted to do that, frankly. But it's not something that I can speak to with any kind of authority. I do, as an outsider, though, want to talk about how familiar we are with hierarchies, how deeply cemented we are with these ideas of hierarchies. And the fact that we understand intrinsically without having any explicit knowledge of it, that some of us were privileged, more privileged than others, even in terms of who could come to Canada. And so we can come to Canada and think, oh, casteism is something that exists somewhere else, and to look around and only hang around with your own caste, people of your own caste, and which is mostly Savarna or upper caste. And I think because I'm ashamed to say this, but I actually understood casteism and the hierarchy because I understood whiteness. And I understood whiteness through Black feminism and through Black, activism and the work that happened. So it didn't come to me naturally. You would think that as somebody who's privileged in caste, that would come to me first, and it did not. And so I think it's really important for us to know that you can't fight anti-Blackness unless you can see caste, and unless you can see the role wherever you are in that hierarchy, however unaware you may be of caste, however you might not be intentionally casteist in your own lives. Unless you see it and challenge it, you can't speak or show up for anti-Black racism, or you can't speak speak in support of Black people or of Indigenous people. And then it's really important as well for me to say that I'm speaking about this in the context of the certain kind of immigrant that Harsha alluded to, which is actually people like me, the people who have come here from India, not necessarily people who were indentured labor taken to East Africa or to the Caribbean and who've made their way here. They too have their own hierarchies, but that's not what I'm speaking about here. So I'm speaking about people who come with, oh, I only had $5 in my pocket, or hey, the other day a guy said, remember, I just came here with 5,000 in my pocket, and now look, I have this $1 million house, right? And so we love these stories about how well we are doing and how successful we are, and we do it and we erase our own people who are not there in terms of a capitalist idea of success. And we understand hierarchies because we have always historically understood them. When we had British colonizers, they didn't come there when the British East India Company came. I don't know if they had any grand scheme of overtaking this great land until you had traders, and then you had Brahmins who benefited, who would rather pay the British India Company enough money to buy weapons against, say, the King of Bengal. And they were, because it meant it would be to their benefit, to their monetary benefit, right? So when you put capital first, then you lose your humanity. And we are well versed with that. So we know how to create hierarchies, but how to negotiate our place in those given hierarchies. And so when people of upper caste, for instance, come here, we've already negotiated power where we've come from. And so we know how to be white adjacent, and we know what makes us palatable. We know how to joke about, how to not be threatening. And even if you don't know, you can kind of pass it off. You can use enough humor. There's enough privilege in your background that you can navigate it, even if you're starting from scratch. But that scratch is not a scratch as it is for everybody else. You're coming with so much knowledge. You're coming with intergenerational education and maybe some wealth. And there's a lot of, you've come from, at least I came from a society where I learned about people like me in my history textbooks. I didn't have that, what my children will have, which is that non-representation at school. I didn't have that. So there was so much going for someone like me compared to what they would be even for my children who are here. I think it's anyway, maybe I'm rambling a little bit, but I'm trying to say that we understand hierarchies, we know how to be white adjacent, be aware of it. Now that you know it, what are you going to do about it? Because if you didn't know about it, that's one thing, but now you know, what are you going to do about it? And that's the challenge.
Yeah, and thank you, Shri, for the reference, particularly to the, thank you for all the nuance and all of that conversation and honesty and vulnerability. And the one thing that stood out for me amongst all the awesome things and brilliant things that you shared was the ways in which, particularly again, not to homogenize, but against particularly immigrant folks, there's this myth of or the narrative of I came with $5 or $5,000 and now I've made it. And that kind of, classic bootstrap type narrative. And the thing that I've been increasingly thinking about is the ways in which a few things stand out about that narrative. One is how similar it is to settler paradigms. We came here and we worked the land, we had nothing. It's except that you were given stolen land. What do you mean you had nothing, right? That kind of hardworking pioneer type mythology that completely erases the subsidy of settler colonialism and the reality of it. And how particularly in the kind of middle class, upper caste, Savarna, North Indian immigrant experience in particular, but of course not exclusive to, but how, also that idea of I came with $5 or $100 completely erases the fact that people often are landowning caste or class, have intergenerational wealth, have land, and that idea of we came as working class, or we were working class immigrants, and now look at my kids. It's actually the working class background was probably a blip in your trajectory, right? That was the exception. If you look at a trajectory of various generations, that was not where your story started. That was perhaps the exceptional moment in your story. And then the ways in which, the such problematic ways in which then we claim also proximity to class struggles that aren't genuine, right? The idea that we're of the working class who made it, that bootstrap theory, which is weaponized particularly against Black and Indigenous people, but really working class people, all racialized working class people. And some of the ways in which I saw that intensely is that, again, just a couple of quick stories was, so I don't know if people elsewhere in Canada have heard about the Sahodas, but the Sahodas are infamous slumlords, Punjabi landlords in Vancouver. They own their properties that they own are valued at over $200 million. And they own they're slumlords. They own two of the most dilapidated housing buildings in the downtown east side, which house mostly Indigenous people, because the downtown east side of Vancouver, for people who are unfamiliar, is notoriously known as one of the poorest neighborhoods in Canada. And 30% of people who live in the downtown east side are Indigenous, although 2% of Vancouver's population are Indigenous people, right? It's the epicenter of the opioid crisis, of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and trans and two-spirit people, of homelessness, like all the stories that one hears. And so the Sahodas are two landlords in this neighborhood, in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood. Just two of their properties are in the downtown east side, but they have many more sprawled across Vancouver. And just in one of their buildings in the downtown east side, they had over 500 City of Vancouver standard of maintenance bylaws violations, right? Which is like, if anybody knows how the city works, the city is not city barely goes against landlords, right? So the fact that the city went against the Sahodas is because their buildings were literally falling down. And it was squalid, like people living in feces, they never cleaned it. Lots of torture, rape, and other things I won't go into. People can look it up. But the thing that the Sahodas always presented themselves as was hard working class people who had nothing when they came to Canada and then made it, right? And they're just one notorious example of many, including, many farmers in BC. And here I'm speaking specifically to the Punjabi experience in the West Coast, right? So many farmers who now employ migrant farm workers on their farms. And in the case of the Sahodas, when, as action started ramping up against them in Sri, because, you're in the media, you may remember or recall, although this was in the West Coast, the Sahodas started to receive a lot of negative media attention, which they deserved. But in some segments of the Punjabi community, it started to be like, oh, look, now the Sahodas are getting targeted. Like, why are they targeting the one Punjabi landlords? What about all the other landlords? And I used to get tons of calls being like, hey, you fight for justice, you fight against racism. Will you speak up for the Sahodas? And this is over 10 years. It has continued, right? Because their legacy is long. And I was like, absolutely not. And I remember, getting slammed, but which is neither here nor there because it's not about me, but just in as much as it reveals the ways in which the community responded to this, it was an expectation that as someone who's anti-racist, that my allegiance would be to this version of anti-racist struggle. And not that anti-racism also means particularly an allegiance to Indigenous women and girls and trans and two-spirit people. And, this was just one of those, just you speaking about that, and it's been on my mind. Also, I'm thoughtful about the ways in which we think anti-racism struggles should look like and what we think our allegiances should look like, which are very much informed by anti-Indigenous, anti-Black racism, and then also caste and class and more, especially as it intersects with the idea of like hardworking immigrants who fought racism to make all their wealth with no interrogation or honesty about where that comes from, and then the impacts of it, right? Because once we say, I'm hardworking and I fought for this, then you become absolved. In your mind, you become absolved from any implications for the havoc that you've reaped, so in the case of this, the Sahodas. And similarly, in the case of farm owners, there was a very public case in BC, in Golden, BC, which is in the interior of the Kyra farm plant, the Kyra farm owners. It was known as the Kyra Industries. That's how they were legally incorporated. And they were tree planters and farm owners. And there was a very public lawsuit launched against them by 55 Congolese refugees for specifically anti-Black racial discrimination. And these 55 Congolese workers won at the BC Human Rights Tribunal. And they were, the folks who fought for them was primarily a Black lawyer by the name of Ross Salvador in BC, who made the case specifically that it is very possible for communities of color to be racist against Black people, right? That anti-Black racism is possible under the legal definition, that it is not just white people who are racist against Black people. And this was an important kind of legal fight in the human rights terrain that Roz in particular fought and won, right? That the Kaira tree planters were racist, specifically anti-Black, to these 55 Congolese tree planter workers that they employed. And the Human Rights Tribunal found that they were kept in quote unquote slave-like conditions. And, you know, this was a $700,000, I believe, I don't remember the exact amount, lawsuit. Again, at that time, you know, we have so many Punjabis in particular and other, you know, basically the farm owner lobby, which is a capitalist lobby, framing this not only as the farm owners being victims of racial discrimination, not the Congolese workers. So again, the insidious ways in which racism gets reversed. And also, again, that their entire capitalist influence, you know, the fact that they're millionaires gets removed from the equation. So just all of that comes to mind. And I'm so thankful that you raised that, because I think it's so important to challenge all of this when we're thinking about our complicities, is the ways in which it's so tangled up.
And sorry, I'm just going to add something else that I thought, which is that I didn't come to this knowledge on my own. As I mentioned, it came through the work of activism and academics. And one thing I would say to other people who might be like me, or maybe at a different point or an earlier point on the continuum of this understanding, is to forget about people and think about the systems, because these invisible systems are the puppets, the puppeteers that are making certain actions happen. And so I would say, I constantly hear people who are South Asian of varied backgrounds say things like, well, but you know, white people are also really nice. And oh my God, we are so much more racist. And oh, but you know, that Muslim person took advantage of this, that, or the other. And that, you know, what about what Pakistan is doing to the Hindus? And I just think when you talk about people, it really confuses people's understanding of what we are dealing with. But when you start naming the hierarchies, and you talk about, in our context here, whiteness, and then whiteness is not white people, whiteness also includes us, whiteness includes or excludes rather Black people, because it is defined by excluding Black people. And then you realize that, no, of course you can have individual white people who are good, and you can have individual brown people who are terrible, or Black people who are not good, and that's okay. They're all still functioning in that hierarchy of whiteness, hierarchy of patriarchy, hierarchy of caste, and move away from, you know, and then once these power dynamics become visible, then you recognize that, yes, it's just as wrong for a Pakistan to discriminate against or treat its Hindus as second-class citizens as it is for India to be doing, frankly, a lot worse with Muslims. But that still doesn't mean that because Pakistan does something and has a certain way of dealing with its minorities, that now therefore Muslims can now be treated with disdain no matter where they come from. You know, those sort of, if we are aware of those nuances of power, then we can approach all of these issues through a more humane point of view. And I think I would like to leave that with people in case they are sort of struggling with understanding how these hierarchies work. Yeah.
Thank you so much to both of you. And I think you touched upon a lot of the, you know, the things I was, you know, wanted to kind of inquire about too, about these issues of brown fragility that come up every time, you know, you bring up racism. You know, people are like, well, we came here, we made it happen, but we still also face racism ourselves. So, you know, how do we, and I see both of you do it on Twitter, but, you know, how do you kind of advise us to go about this brown fragility? How do we combat this within our communities? And, you know, you mentioned the system, but, you know, really focusing on those systems, but how do we as a community, understand that we're tools of white supremacy, and how do we begin to change that kind of inner consciousness that we have?
Ooh. Do you want to go, Arshad?
Sure. I mean, I won't say too much on that, because I'm tend not to be too prescriptive, and again, I make no assumptions about where people are at in terms of their personal location, but more importantly, what people's kind of identity-based locations are. Again, where our responsibilities are nuanced, and our social locations are nuanced. So it's really hard for me to be prescriptive in that way and to say, like, go out and get a Twitter too or whatever. But I do think, I think it's multifold. I think certainly we all know and are aware of the ways in which anti-Black comments and anti-Blackness deeply plays out in our families, the kinds of, dinner table conversations, the ways in which anti-Indigenous racism plays out, the ways in which casteism plays out, and or we're impacted by. So again, I don't want to assume where folks are at or who people are. And so, I think, really that idea of doing the work in our families and our networks is so important. Something that the Equality Lab's conversation yesterday has been mentioned, something that the Mosey talked about yesterday that stood out to me a lot was the importance of also disrupting the networks of power. So the idea that, that caste or Hindutva only exists in the US is completely false, or that Kamala Harris is just a US phenomenon. Like there's actually more examples of that in Canada, frankly, right? Of like brown faces in high places who are negotiating power and who are the tools of white supremacy, frankly, in Canada than the US, right? Because the myth of multiculturalism in Canada means that specifically North Indian Savarnas have been placed in a particular social location of power, even more so than in the US. So we have way more of those people to disrupt. I recently learned that, or not recently, a few years ago, learned that, again, as homogenizing as this term is, but even compared more so than white people, South Asians are overrepresented in positions of political power. If you look at, provincial provinces, so if you look at MLAs, MPPs, whatever they are in each respective province, federal government and municipal governments, South Asians are actually proportional to our population are actually overrepresented in halls of political power, for what's that's worth, right? So we can't assume that Kamala Harris is just in the US. There's lots of hers in Canada. So we have a role to play in disrupting people, not to get caught up in the narrative of representation when it's, a South Asian, for example, but to really interrogate systems of power and to challenge particularly politicians or networks of Hindutva money, those networks in temples and gurdwaras and wherever else they are at a systemic level, to challenge those at the structural power level, I think is so deeply important. And then also, of course, the systemic work, right? To actively align with Black and Indigenous liberation struggles, right? To show up for those struggles, to echo those demands, to amplify those demands, to take those risks, to do what we can depending on where we're at, but to show up in those concrete ways is so important. But really, it's so past time to let go of the idea of representation as a metric of success. Like that is like such a phenomenon that particularly South Asians should have never held on to, but now is really the time to not use that as our measure of anti-racist struggle, and to really, actively hold the feet to the fire for those who claim to speak for our communities, right? Because that's part of the ways that works too, is people can start to speak for the South Asian community and claim that representation. So to really push back against that narrative. And to really amplify other struggles, to show up. Shri, you were talking earlier about the ways in which there was such a discrepancy between, CBC and Real People's Media in Tyendinaga. So what are the ways in which we can amplify that media and to have conversations in our families and to show up, in all the WhatsApp groups, be present when you're able to really disrupt those narratives, and to speak back against the dehumanization of Kashmiris and to speak about the colonial occupation of Kashmir, right? All of these are interrelated struggles against imperialism and systemic racism, specifically anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, and caste oppression.
I'd say, when we talk about disrupting systems, and how do we break that down? And to me, it looks like, for instance, there was a Kashmiri Pandit who was invited to give a speech to, I can't remember, it was a some sort of a foundation, and he spoke eloquently and had a lot of misinformation in there about how Kashmiri Pandits were the true victims, which many of them were, but without the nuance of understanding the entire, like the history of Kashmir that didn't start in 1947, and it didn't start with Article whatever it is. Sorry, when I'm when I get really bothered about something, my mind just freezes. But and so I think maybe when we should be more organized, and when we hear of something like this happening, then we should start disrupting it, figure out how are we going to disrupt it, and put pressure on the people who are inviting people like this, and platforming them, and put pressure on them and make them look as not just foolish, but also harmful as they really are. And so I think there's a lot of organizing that should happen against these organizations that we hold up in high esteem, and stop that reverence for money. Like, just stop equating money with power and holding it up to that high standard, and start disrupting it. And I also, the other thing is, if you're already in an office, let's say, and your white adjacency got you there, and I'm not saying that was the only thing that will get you there. Skill would have got you there, hard work would have got you there, luck would have got you there. The fact that you are not Black would have also got you there. That may have also played a role. In that case, then try to be a co-conspirator with Blackness if there are no Black colleagues around. But if there are Black colleagues around, then you're not going to be a savior, but build relationships and be a co-conspirator, amplify, stand up with them. If something happens, if there's a meeting and we know whose voices are least heard, then keep an ear out, look out for each other. Like, even if all of us don't necessarily have the sophisticated language of anti-racism struggles, I think we can all still have common decency. And that can be, and I'm not talking about kindness, and I'm not talking about empathy, I'm just talking about humanity, right? And so we can all have that, and look around in whatever space that you have, and how can you disrupt it. And sometimes, you have to make sacrifices. You might lose friends in the process. You might have to make new friends. You start building other relationships that are actually more meaningful. And those sacrifices are worth it, because then you are more liberated. You're not going to achieve salvation in life, but you can at least try to be more liberated from the sort of thinking that is an unbearable stain on our conscience if we do nothing.
Thank you, Sri. And
I have a question here. I know that we were asked to take questions.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to read that out too. I'm really glad you saw that.
Go ahead. I was keeping
my eye. Go ahead.
I know that was something we were asked to do. Thank you, Sri, for those comments. And there's a question here. If I could explain more how to disrupt networks of power, and what does it mean to not get caught up in the representation narrative? So I was just going to expand a bit on that, and I think Shree's also talked about that already. So for me, disrupting networks of power is similar to what we've been talking about, like thinking about the ways in which certain people get, if there are invited speakers who really represent a harmful agenda, whatever that harmful agenda might be, to ensure that we show up to disrupt that, whether that's showing up in protest, whether that's, writing to the people who organize the event, whatever that looks like. It's hard to say without, it's so context specific what tactics one might choose. But to really, to not be silent in those kinds of situations. We also know that a lot of places of worship, for example, have invited guests, including the police, so to really show up in alliance with Black and Indigenous struggles, also very much means to refuse the presence of police, right, in our spaces, not just as something that makes us unsafe, or even if it does make us feel safe because we occupy spaces of privilege, to show up in alliance with Black and Indigenous struggles, to say we're refusing the police, right? Like, this is not something that we can allow in our community kind of places of worship or our community centers or our gatherings. Oftentimes also multicultural events very much invite politicians, right? And so, I mean, there's, again, many tactics. I've been involved in tactics where we absolutely go and disrupt conservative South Asian Sikhs who show up to multicultural events to be like, no, like, you just can't be here in this role. It's offensive, given what your government represents. Like, this is not a parade for you to, it's not a PR stunt, right? Especially when they show up for, when they show up to Vaisakhi and things like that. So I think we're all probably familiar and we're all part of different networks in the community. But when we see, things like politicians who represent harm, police officers, invited speakers who represent an Hindutva agenda, like, just there's so many who are given a platform. And I absolutely agree with Shri, like, we just have to get organized to disrupt those spaces, because sometimes it is often easier to show up to things other people have organized and to be like, oh, I'm showing up to to really replace the burden on Black and Indigenous peoples to organize, right? Because they're constantly fighting and to show up to their events, which is such a key part of it. But we also have to organize ourselves to show up in our community spaces, to create narratives in our communities that refuse these harmful kind of agendas and systems of power. So that's also our responsibility. And in terms of what I mean by not get caught up in representation, I mean just that narrative where we're like, oh, look, awesome, that person is the first whatever. Excited when simply because someone looks like us, irrespective of what they represent, irrespective of the harm they cause, irrespective of the systems of power that they perpetuate, where we say that we support them simply because they look like us and we feel represented, which is not to say representation is not important. But I think there are many people that we can turn to look for representation. We don't only have to look at, the politicians or cops for our representation. We can look to each other. We also have many other unwritten, unhighlighted histories. I think of Pritam Kaur, who is now a 94-year-old working class Punjabi, who was one of the founders of the Canadian Farm Workers Union as a working class Punjabi immigrant. And, she stood up to racism and sexism and classism and capitalism on farms. And she fought against sexual assault on Canadian farms. So people like her, there's so many, but those are the people who we can turn to when we're thinking about representation, and who our idols are, really. And so for me, that's what it means to not get caught up in representation. And I would really echo also what Shri said, which is that there's no kind of clear path. And we also, we learn by doing, I've been called out legitimately for anti-Indigenous, anti-Black racism many times. And I say that not with like pride or shame, but just as fact, because that is part of the learning. None of us are born knowing these things. Part of the struggle is to let go of the idea that we know all the things, that we are constantly learning. And as this event opened, like, we're co-learners, and to really be humble about that, right? To be humble about the fact that being brown doesn't mean we understand white supremacy. It doesn't mean that at all.
Yeah. Can I jump in? Without, I didn't interrupt you, I hope, Harsha. Okay. But I just wanted to say that triggered a thought. Just remembered, I've been receiving these emails from various groups. I've received emails from, say, Muslim groups who talk about solidarity with, anti-Black racism, the reckoning, what, how they would like to help or what their statement is. I've received something from a Sikh group as well, which has, we have to learn to do this. We have to decenter ourselves. And I want to really talk about, the understanding that decentering yourselves when you're talking about anti-Black racism, or when you're talking about casteism and you're not a caste oppressed person yourself, are super, super important, because it's really not about you. And I've got all these really thoughtful emails. And then I got one, and I'm sorry to be so harsh on Brahmins, but we got to do it, which is that I got this from a Hindu group, and it said, here is our solidarity statement. And it was a Brahmin, I can tell from the name, man. And then he says, we are alongside our Black brothers and sisters. We also suffer. And it went into enough detail that completely erased Black struggle and turned it into, we've also suffered. And then comes the kicker at the very end. We think they should resolve their problems through Hindu meditation. I think it was a spelling mistake. I think they meant mediation. I don't know, because how can meditation be Hindu? And I thought, where to center yourself here, guys? Like, this is not about black people at all. So how, if you come with if you cannot let go of the idea of your supremacy, and I know, again, I'm not singling only Hindus out. If there is any brown fragility around this, that's fine. But I know that various people have their own supremacy issues, but I'm talking specifically about Hindu supremacy. We have to let go of the idea that just because we are an ancient civilization, that we therefore had all the answers before everybody else did. And therefore we will come to help you. And that's our idea of solidarity. And for God's sake, no, decenter yourself. You are not, this is not about you at all. This is not about your struggles at all. And in fact, if you do that, and if you are able to show up for Black people, if you are able to show up for First Nations, Métis, Inuit, it is going to help you, but this is really not about you. And so I just wanted to put that out there because that's something that had really bothered me.
That's awesome.
That's cool.
Meditation.
Yeah. And why is it Hindu? I don't know when meditation became Hindu. Why? You know, it may be spiritual? Is it necessarily religious? Why are you bringing that? Oh, anyway.
Yeah. Well, it's like Modi's big yoga thing, right? His International Day of Yoga crap stuff. Yeah.
I just want to get back to something that Harsha, you said, and sorry to bring it back to Kamala Harris. I just think she's so topical right now, and it's, it's not really even about her. All these issues that we're talking about, like you mentioned, Harsha, like there's so many, brown faces in high places in Canada too, and so. I think we understand that representation isn't the be all and end all. Like, we should be looking at policies, but then what do we do with someone that, seemingly has a lot of power and has, perhaps the potential to make a difference? Do we, what do we do with this with these like imperfect figures in our communities? Is there room to be critical and supportive of individuals like Kamala? And can we interrogate her past record, but also kind of hold her accountable for what she's gonna do? Is there the opportunity to do both?
I mean, I guess from my perspective, that's no different from any politician. Like, I don't think that someone like Kamala Harris should somehow be immune to rigorous scrutiny and criticism simply because she in particular, has a South Asian background, and specifically a Brahmin background, right? And that's, and again, in the Canadian context, Jagmeet Singh, perfect example. And for Jagmeet Singh, there's a really particular pride in the Sikh community, right? Because it's not only that he's South Asian, he's Punjabi Sikh, he's visibly Sikh. And that again that is a very particular legacy in Canada in the context of the 1984 genocide of Sikhs, in the context of Air India, and the very specific criminalization of Sikh people, especially in the West Coast. He's, of course, he's now in the West Coast. His office is in Burnaby, or he represents Burnaby, but he's largely, of course, based in where you all are in Toronto. But in Toronto and in Vancouver, there's a very particular imprint of intergenerational trauma for the Sikh community, and so that plays a big part in how people understand Jagmeet. He wears the kirpan and many other things, and so absolutely, I understand the struggles that he and his family and many others like him, my family's Sikh, have faced. That doesn't mean that as the leader of the NDP, who now heads an entire political machine, that I am going to be personally more easy on him on issues like Wet'suwet'en, on issues of, many issues. That's just one that came to mind because he spoke at various times in a flip-floppy way in support of Coastal GasLink pipeline in Wet'suwet'en territory. So for me, it's not about holding, like, I can personally understand someone's struggle, but once you're in a position of power, it's not that your personal struggle doesn't matter, but that's not it can absolutely not override or cloud the responsibility that position is beholden to. And so for me, that's the overriding piece, is really like, what are people doing? You know, especially when you're heading up agents of the state, when you're responsible for a state institution, not only, but as a prime example, that's really central, because the impact that your policies have is key. And that, I think, is the most important thing. And so, you know, people can be, and I think we also have to be aware that in multicultural Canada, you know, videos of South Asian celebration and dance and cuisine are intended, those are PR machines intended to make us feel excited about the state, about us becoming part of the state. So I think, if anything, we have to actually do our hardest to not succumb to those, right? And our instincts are to be like, oh, look at that awesome video. Like, look at what like perfect Punjabi that person's speaking, or like, look at those awesome Bhangra moves, you know, that Jagmeet's doing. And, you know, just using him as an example, there's others. But I think we have to work against that instinct, precisely for the reason it's intended to entice us. Not only about how we feel, but it's intended to have a political enticement. It's intended to make us vote in a particular way. It's intended to make us not be critical on purpose. And so I think that's important. And we can hold both of those nuances together, right? Like when Jagmeet is facing overt white supremacy, and, you know, he's targeted in all the ways he's been, it's very possible to stand up and show up for him in the ways that we would show up for most people and say, you know, this is racism. This is specifically anti-Sikh racism. This is targeting of a Sikh person. And continue to criticize that person if and as needed. I think those are absolutely necessary for us to do.
And, you know, talking about someone like Jagmeet saying he, you know, that's kind of, we're seeing brown leadership in a white supremacist system. So then my question becomes, is it possible to not perpetuate anti-Blackness as a leader? And I think, Shri, I found it really interesting what you wrote in your recent article about Kamala Harris, saying that for many of us, those barriers to success are amplified if you don't adhere to the standards of likability and credibility imposed by whiteness. Individual success often comes at the cost of ignoring collective needs. So how can South Asians then reconcile individual success without addressing collective needs and being accomplices in the fight to dismantle white supremacy?
Look, we are all partaking in a capitalist system, whether we like it or not, right? So we all have mouths to feed, mortgages to pay, and so you get a job, you get that job, even if it means, you know, if as long as you're not going out of your way to be extra palatable and to sort of tamp down on your own identity, have pride in your identity, no matter what it is, and go down, and then you get it, and, you know, go there, accept it with grace, but then take it upon yourselves to then use whatever that place of privilege is to do something for other people. You may do it in your personal lives, you may do as much as you can in your professional lives, but it is possible. I think it is possible when you have like-minded people to be able to come together and do things for the greater good, once you let go of the idea that your idea of fun is going to the next big resort, right? And to not become necessarily further participants, mindless participants of capitalism, but mindful ones. And that will mean that, yes, you participate in it, but you will do so thinkingly. You know, maybe you won't, maybe the next time you go to somebody's cottage or you decide you want to buy a cottage, then you think about whose land that is on, you know, and feel that crushing weight of the injustice of the existence of places like that, right? So when you start mindfully doing it, I think you start taking decisions that will make you do things more for the collective good, much more than just simply for your own good. But you can never take away just your own good. You can never, if you have to exist, you can't take away the idea that you have to do things for yourself. You do. and you want to do, you want your children to be kind of safe. You want to make sure they're looked after. These are human instincts, so don't be guilty. And I'm kind of also addressing my answer at a comment that I see someone saying that, I have a lot of hatred, self-hatred being South Asian. And I think I should have maybe pulled myself back from my critiques earlier, because, I get passionate about that critique, but remember, racism is violence. And when you face racism, it is still violent. It is not the intergenerational dehumanization of what Black and First Nations, Métis, Inuit people feel, but it is still violent. So do practice self-love as well. And because, if I have to have a violent analogy, I would say for us as brown people, racism would be whiteness facing the barrel of a gun from whiteness, but also having one gun pointed at somebody else, right? So it doesn't make you less violent, but it doesn't make you more safe either. And so figure out how you're going to put down those guns and work together. But don't feel hatred, because the minute you feel hatred, the minute you feel guilt, then it starts consuming you. It becomes about you and less about other people. So it's natural. I think it's very difficult to escape some guilt when you come to that awareness. And it's a little difficult sometimes to escape that feeling of revulsion. At the same time, accept it, put it away, and proceed with love, because don't waste your energies on self-hatred.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to that a bit too, because really guilt and self-hatred are immobilizing to us individually, but they're also immobilizing to the struggle. In the ways in which we show up in movements is really about being able to show up in ways. Because the other thing that guilt does, and Shri, to your point earlier about not decentering ourselves, guilt and self-hatred also are ways of showing up. There's one way in which we center ourselves, which is like the arrogance and the savior. And the other one is also the like deeply navel gazing, not self-reflective, which we all need, but the intense guilt paralysis, immobilization, self-hatred. And so I think it's so important to, work through that. It's not that we can pretend it doesn't exist. We have these kind of emotional roller coasters, and that makes sense as part of our processing. But to really move to a place of responsibility is such a key part of it. And I do think, and this for me comes from my personal kind of perspective, but I think collective action and collective struggle, that can look like lots of things. Collective struggle looks like different things. But I really think collective struggle is the way that we respond to systemic issues, right? Because of course we're all individually complicit. Like that's a rabbit hole we're all in. And we can all, in the same ways that, we're not gonna save the planet by all like recycling and by all always, by turning, like not existing, existing off the grid. Like that's just not the world that we're in. That's not the individual choices we can all make. So I think it's also really important in similarly in these contexts to think about what actions we can take, but to not get overwhelmed by the impossibility. Like that's the nature of the systemic, is if we only think about what we can do individually, we will guaranteed to feel overwhelmed and inadequate, because these answers they're not structurally built to be contained by individuals' choice, right? And so just going back to the idea of like, are we always complicit? Yes, we're always complicit. That's the reality. We are always complicit. There is no, there's no magical Alice in Wonderland door that we can find, that we can leave that all behind. We are all complicit. It's day in, day out. Christina Sharp talks about anti-Blackness as the weather. This is all around us. And so the question is, what can I do individually and what can I do collectively? And how can I make this part of my life in a way that's like a commitment to reflection, a commitment to action, a commitment to showing up, that doesn't overwhelm me in this moment. And, of course, overwhelm is such an initial and ongoing part of how we process things. But it's so important. I mean, that's why I think organizing is so important, because we just really, it's not because I'm biased to organizing, even though I am. It's really the only way we can individually survive the overwhelmingness of these structures, is to show up in ways with other people. because our individual choices will always be constrained. They're intended to be.
And on that powerful note, I want to thank both our esteemed speakers, Harsha and Shri, for engaging in this dialogue today, and for continuing to lead the discussion on dismantling racism and oppression that's been seeped in our South Asian communities. You know, I'd also like to thank our audience today for being present with us. You know, we've curated a resource list that can also be found in the comments section. We hope that these help you in your anti-racist learning journey and activate you to take action. We hope you all continue engaging in this work in as many realms of your life as you can. And to echo the sentiments of our speakers, that we are all complicit and this is an uphill battle. It's about putting in the work. It's in the face of power, in the face of systems that have no interest in losing grip in what it holds, and has every interest maintaining the status quo. And then this battle can really take place in our minds, in our homes, our places of work and worship, and more than anything, it must continue. And I just like to say that one plug for our organization, we're really excited to announce that we want, as an organization, to grow, and we want to start recruiting people who are looking to get involved in organizing, like Harsha urged everyone to do. And in the work we're doing, we're really looking for people who are extremely passionate. We want to encourage individuals with any kind of experience in activism and social justice to get involved. So please apply. The recruitment form is available in the description of this video. And yeah, I just want to say have a good night. Thank you, everyone, and let's get to work.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening, guys.
And also, I just wanted to note there's a comment by a comrade about leaving a meditation sangha in BC because of their anti-Blackness, and I just want to express how angering it is, and just really sorry to hear that happened. I think it's important for us to see those, and just wanted to name that comment in there.
Thank you, Anisha.